Thank you for tuning in to LeadDeveloper.com, where we simplify complex property development feasibilities, investment analysis, and everything real estate. Whether you're a seasoned pro or just starting out, our Google Sheets-based feasibility suite streamlines the toughest aspects of real estate. Lead Developer Feasibility Suite is trusted by thousands in over 17 countries. Our tools cover everything from quick assessments to detailed cash flow projections and more. Sign up today at LeadDeveloper.com for unlimited free access to our expanding library of real estate tools. No credit card needed. Plus, get full support through Edge with step-by-step guidance, exclusive courses, and resources designed for your success. Turn numbers into narratives that win over investors and lenders. Join Lead Developer now.
Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're going deep on property appraisals.
Ooh, exciting.
Yeah, we've got some really interesting sources that you sent in, including an article called 9 Steps in Property Appraisal Process. So whether you're thinking about selling your house or refinancing.
We're just curious about how much your place is actually worth.
Exactly. We're going to break it all down. So I think most people listening probably know that appraisals are important, but can you give us like a quick explanation of what an appraisal actually is and like why it matters so much?
Sure, yeah. A property appraisal is basically like a professional opinion of a property's market value. And it's super important for a couple of reasons. First, for lenders, it helps them decide, how much they're willing to loan out.
Makes sense.
And it also helps buyers make sure they're not, overpaying for a property.
So it kind of protects both sides of the transaction?
Exactly.
Cool. Well, let's dive into that article then, the 9 steps. Where do we even start?
Well, I think a good place to start is actually with choosing the appraiser, because a lot of people don't realize that, the lender often picks the appraiser.
Oh, interesting.
But there are some situations, like if you're getting a pre-listing appraisal, where you might have more say in who gets chosen.
So it's not totally out of your hands?
Right.
So what happens after you've got the appraiser then?
One of the early steps that often surprises people is this thing called project feasibility.
Project feasibility.
Yeah. So basically the appraiser doesn't just like look at your house in isolation. They're actually thinking about the whole, the whole project and whether it makes sense.
Okay, so like what kind of things would make a project not feasible?
Oh, tons of things. Like, are there enough, comparable properties in the area? Or are there any zoning issues or, environmental regulations that could be a problem? Basically, they're looking at the big picture.
So they're not just comparing your house to the one down the street. They're thinking about like the whole context.
Exactly.
And this all leads into what, step 6?
Step 6 is the loan proposal.
Okay, so the lender is using that appraisal to
figure out, the loan amount and how much risk they're taking on.
Got it. So the appraisal's really like at the heart of that whole financing process. Now, I noticed that in the article, there's this whole step about a conservative bias. What's that all about?
Yeah, this is a really important point. Appraisers often tend to underestimate value. And there are a few reasons for that. I think one is that they don't want to overestimate the value and risk getting criticized or sued.
Right, so they're kind of playing it safe.
Exactly. And they also want to, keep their lender clients happy. Lenders generally prefer conservative appraisals because it, minimizes their risk if the borrower defaults.
Okay, that makes sense. But if they're being conservative, doesn't that mean that like sellers could end up getting less than their property is worth?
It's possible, yeah. But that's where step 8 comes in, which is about influencing the appraisal.
Wait, hold on. Are you saying that we can actually like influence what the appraiser decides?
To a certain extent, yes. And it's not about, bribing anyone or anything unethical. It's more about being proactive and making sure that the appraiser has all the relevant information.
So if you think like recent market trends haven't been fully reflected,
exactly,
you can kind of bring that to their attention.
Yep. And remember, you can actually influence the appraisal in either direction. So like if you think the appraisal might be too high and you're worried about future property taxes, you could actually try to nudge it lower.
That's a really interesting way to think about it. So while appraisers have their own biases, there's still some room for, open communication.
For sure.
To make sure that you're getting a fair assessment.
Absolutely. Now, once the appraiser has considered all those factors, they're going to use one or more valuation methods to actually determine the property's value.
And I think the article mentioned there are 3 main methods, right?
That's right. The most common one is the market approach, also known as the sales comparison approach, which basically involves comparing your property to similar properties or comps that have recently sold in the area.
So they're looking at what similar houses have sold for in your neighborhood.
Precisely. And they make adjustments to account for any differences between your property and the comps, like location, size, condition, even things like the date of sale.
Wow, those adjustments sound really complex.
They can be, but they're essential to make sure the comparison is apples to apples. So for example, if your house is on a quiet street and the comp is on a busy one, the appraiser might adjust the comp's value downward to reflect that difference in location.
Yeah, location I feel like would be a big one. What about the other two methods?
Okay, so the second method is called the income capitalization approach. And this one is mostly used for properties that generate income, like rental apartments or commercial buildings.
Places where you're making money from rent, basically.
Exactly. And this method uses a formula to determine the value based on the property's net operating income and a capitalization rate.
Okay, I'm going to need a little more explanation on that one. What is a capitalization rate?
So the capitalization rate, or cap rate, reflects the expected rate of return on the investment. So think of it like this.
Yeah.
If you were buying this property as an investment, how much profit would you expect to make each year relative to the purchase price? The cap rate helps translate that expected return into a property value.
So it's about like the income potential of the property. How do they even figure out the cap rate, though?
They look at, recent sales of comparable income-producing properties, and they consider things like, expected growth and depreciation. The article actually uses the example of office buildings to show how they calculate it, based on, the net operating income and the purchase price of similar buildings.
Okay, that's helpful.
A lot of number crunching.
What's the final method, then?
All right, so the last one is the cost approach. This method considers the cost to rebuild the property from scratch, including things like materials, labor, permits.
So they're basically figuring out what it would cost to build an identical property today.
Essentially, yes. However, they also factor in depreciation to account for wear and tear on the existing structure.
Right.
So the cost approach is often used for new construction or unique properties where it's hard to find comparable sales.
Which makes sense, like if it's something really unique.
Exactly. And it's not always the most accurate method, though.
Really?
Yeah, it can be tough to estimate those rebuilding costs accurately, especially for older properties.
So the appraiser's going to choose like the method or combination of methods that they think is most appropriate for the situation.
Right. And it's important to remember that Step 9 reminds us that appraisals are ultimately human judgments. They're not perfect.
Right.
So it's really important to review the appraisal report yourself, understand what the appraisers considered, and make sure you're comfortable with their conclusions.
I think a lot of people just kind of take the appraisal at face value.
It's understandable. But you have the right to question anything that seems off. You should always make sure that the information in the report is accurate and that the appraiser's assumptions and reasoning make sense to you.
This has been incredibly insightful. I feel like I have a much better grasp on how appraisals work now.
I'm glad to hear that.
We'll be right back after a quick.
All right, so we're back. We've talked about the steps and those different valuation methods, but what about the actual appraisal report? What should people be looking for when they finally get that thing in their hands?
Yeah, the report itself can seem pretty overwhelming at first, but it's really just like a detailed explanation of how the appraiser arrived at that final number. It's going to include, the property details, all the data on the comparable properties that they use.
The comps.
Exactly. And of course, their final opinion of the value.
So it's kind of like a roadmap of their whole thought process.
Yeah, I like that.
So where's a good place to even start when you're looking at this report? Well, I always recommend starting with the basics. Just double check that all the details about your property are correct. So things like the address, lot size, square footage, number of bedrooms and bathrooms.
You don't want to find out later that they got something wrong.
Exactly. Then once you've verified all that, take a close look at the comparable properties they used.
The comps.
Yep. Ask yourself, are these really good comps for my property? Are they in a similar location? Do they have comparable features and size?
And that's where those adjustments come in.
Right, exactly. So pay close attention to the adjustments they made and whether they seem reasonable to you. If you think an adjustment is too high or too low, don't hesitate to ask the appraiser for clarification.
So it's not just like a one-way street.
Not at all. You should be actively engaging with the report, making sure that makes sense to you.
Now, are there any like red flags that people should be looking for?
Definitely. One big red flag is if they're using comps that are significantly different from your property. So for example, if you have a single-family home and they're using condos as comps, that's a problem.
Like apples and oranges.
Right. Another red flag is if the appraiser doesn't really explain those adjustments they've made, They should clearly explain, why they made each adjustment and how they arrived at the specific dollar amount.
So transparency is key.
Absolutely. And finally, just watch out for any inconsistencies or errors in the report. If something seems off or doesn't add up, don't just ignore it.
So it's all about being thorough and like paying attention to the details. Now, earlier we talked about that conservative bias in appraisals. Can you maybe talk about that a little bit more?
Sure. As we mentioned, appraisers often tend to err on the side of caution and underestimate value. But while that might seem like a disadvantage for sellers, there are actually some situations where it could work in their favor.
Oh, really?
Yeah, like think about property taxes. A lower appraisal means you'll pay less in property taxes each year.
That's a good point.
And if you're a buyer, a conservative appraisal can actually give you more negotiating power.
How so?
Well, let's say the appraisal comes in lower than the seller's asking price. You can use that to negotiate a lower purchase price.
Oh, I see. So that conservative bias, it can actually create opportunities for both buyers and sellers, depending on the circumstances.
Exactly.
This has been so eye-opening. I feel like I've learned a ton about appraisals.
That's what we're here for. Knowledge is power when it comes to real estate.
Absolutely. Now, before we wrap up, I wanted to touch on something else from the article. This idea of influencing appraisals. It seems like there's a fine line between, advocating for yourself and potentially manipulating the system.
Yeah, that's a really important point. It's totally ethical to provide the appraiser with, additional information that you think is relevant, but it's crucial to do it with transparency and honesty.
No bribing, no pressuring, no trying to game the system.
Right. The goal is to just make sure that the appraiser has all the information they need to make, a fair and accurate assessment of your property's value.
So to recap, we've covered like all the ins and outs of property appraisals, from the steps involved to the different valuation methods, even how to review that report. Any final thoughts for our listener before we wrap things up?
I'd just say, the more you understand about appraisals, the better equipped you'll be to protect your interests and make informed decisions when buying, selling, or refinancing a property.
Absolutely. We've covered a lot of ground today. But, the world of real estate is always changing.
Always something new to learn.
I guess the takeaway is to stay curious and never stop asking questions.
Couldn't agree more.
Okay, so, we've covered a lot of ground on these property appraisals today. But, as always, on the deep dive, we like to leave you with something to kind of chew on, think about a little bit more.
Yeah, I think a really interesting question is, we've talked about how these appraisals can be influenced, but what does that really mean for the bigger picture, for the real estate market as a whole?
Right, because if everybody's out there trying to nudge their appraisal up or down, does that end up distorting property values?
Yeah, it's a valid concern. It really raises some interesting questions about potential biases that might be baked into the system.
I mean, could certain types of properties or even like whole neighborhoods be systematically undervalued or overvalued?
It's definitely possible. And these are tough questions with, not always clear-cut answers.
Right. It's a good reminder that even though we've been talking about individual properties, these appraisals can have like ripple effects
Oh, yeah, for sure.
throughout the entire market.
I think the key takeaway is that appraisals are a powerful tool, but like any tool, they need to be used responsibly.
With an awareness of the potential consequences.
Exactly.
So a property appraisal is super important, obviously, but it's not just about the number itself. It's about understanding the process.
Being aware of those potential biases.
Right, and using that knowledge to your advantage to make smart decisions.
Absolutely.
Well, I think that's a perfect place to wrap things up. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of property appraisals.
It's been fun.
We hope you learned something new. And as always, keep exploring, keep learning, and we'll see you next time.